Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of Sorastro's The Lord of the Rings painting series. In this episode we're going to paint the Orc Taskmasters, Pit Goblins and the Shadowmen from the Shadowed Paths expansion to Fantasy Flight Games' The Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. As in the previous episode, I'm going to be speed painting my way through the miniatures, making use of the contrast colours to achieve a good tabletop standard without too much effort. Please note that you can find a link to a PDF guide for the spawn of Ungoliant in the video description, which means I'm actually now covering the last of the enemy figures from the Shadowed Paths expansion. I've prepared the figures exactly as described in the previous video, which means priming in black followed with some zenithal highlights applied from above, and I've also used some pure white and a combination of dry brushing and edge highlighting to sharpen the detail. I'm going to begin by painting all of the Orcs and Goblins, followed by the Shadowmen, who I'll be giving a little more attention to, and as usual you'll find chapter links to help you navigate the episode. Let's begin. You could of course paint the Orcs and Goblins using the same approach as detailed in the very first episode. Since then, however, the contrast colours have been released, which I find makes the process that bit more efficient, although the basic idea of applying semi-translucent colours over a zenithal pattern of light and shade remains the same. I'm going to first paint all of the skin tones, where I generally like to use two different colours to create some tonal interest, and there are a range of colours you could explore to do this. For this goblin, I'm using Plaguebearer Flesh, along with a little Militarum Green for the shadows. It doesn't really matter which colour you apply first, but here I'm placing some of the darker tone into the shadows of the legs. And I'm now applying the lighter tone, doing a little wet blending along the way. And I'm continuing round the rest of the model. This approach gives us some fairly luminous skin tones with a nice bit of variation all in a single pass. Here I'm trying some Fyreslayer Flesh in the shadows instead. And for this one, I'm using Guilliman Flesh with just a little Shyish Purple in the shadows. As always, I like to recommend trying out different tones and combinations to see what works for you. Although ironically, I'd suggest avoiding the contrast colour Orc Flesh, which I find somewhat garish and unnatural looking. Another approach, if you don't like wet blending, might be to simply paint the whole area with the lighter tone, then brush on your shadow tone afterwards, as I'm doing here with some Magos Purple over some Plaguebearer Flesh. With the skin tones complete, I'm now going to paint all of the areas of metal, and you could use pretty much any silver tone you like to do this. I'm using some of the Scalecolor metallics because I like the super fine flakes. For the various sections of leather, I'm using some heavier tones, such as Snakebite Leather, Wyldwood, and Black Templar. I'll use the same tone for different sections of alternative models to create some variety, of course. This is the Snakebite Leather. And this is Wyldwood, which I also used for all of the spear shafts. And this is Black Templar, which I'm also using for the whips of the Taskmasters. To give the Taskmasters some sense of uniformity and rank, I've chosen to paint all of their tunics with a mix of Magos Purple and Blood Angel's Red. I'm now using some Ivory to clean up some of the smaller remaining areas that I want to appear lighter. This means mainly the rope belts, fur lining on the boots, and what looks like some kind of tooth necklace on the Orc Taskmasters. I'm then using a roughly equal mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil to shade these areas down, along with all of the metalwork. It's quite okay if this hits some of the surrounding areas. For the fur on the back, I wanted a lighter tone, so here I'm using Skeleton Horde. For this one, I'm using Apothecary White. And this is a mixture of the two. To finish the Orcs and Goblins off, I've chosen to add a few quick highlights to some of the areas of dark leather. This is just a mix of black, dark sea blue, and varying amounts of white. I'm also picking out the edge of the spears with a little buff. Next, I've chosen to add a little war paint to some of the goblins by adding a simple stroke of red running from the head down to the chin. We can also add a little rust or dried blood to the weapons and armour. And I've chosen to add some markings in white too. Apart from adding some basing, this completes the Orcs and Goblins. Let's now paint the Shadow Men. I took inspiration for my Shadow Men from the representation of the Army of the Dead in the Lord of the Rings movies, where they have an ethereal green glow complemented with some warmer browns and oranges. I'm going to begin by painting the weapons and armour using Thrash Metal, darkened down with a little black, and once again, pretty much any silver tone would be fine for this. I've thinned this down a reasonable amount, and as usual, I like to add a little flow enhancer into the water I use to thin with. This next bit is somewhat optional, but here I'm mixing in some white and I'm pushing the values back up for the main edges and raised details. I'm also sketching out some non-metallic metal style reflections, mainly on the swords, varying the placement between the different figures. I'm now going to colour the entire figure using a roughly 3:1 mix of Aethermatic Blue and Fluorescent Yellow. You can see that this is transparent enough to allow plenty of the underlying values to show through. Once dry, we've already achieved a pretty good tabletop standard, and there'd be nothing wrong with stopping here if you like. I'd really like to achieve a lot more tonal interest and contrast however, so I'm going to begin by brushing some Guilliman Flesh into the shadows and recesses. I'm firstly applying this thinned with a little medium. This begins to introduce some pleasing tonal contrast, whilst also creating the suggestion of some aged weathering. I'm now applying this neat for the deeper shadows and recesses. I also experimented with using some Magos Purple to introduce some more subtle colour modulation on the metalwork. Things are now starting to look a bit more interesting, but I'd like to go further still. So I'm now going to use some inks to maximise the depth in the shadows, and will also be playing with some of the orange and old rust tones from Secret Weapon. I'm using mainly the Chesnut ink by Scalecolor to really push the definition of some of the shadows. And here I'm trying a little of the violet ink. I'm now freely adding some of the rust tones. Next I'm going to push the contrast of the metalwork and the face by firstly picking out the brightest spots and edges with some pure white. I'm then going to glaze over the highlights with a free mix of Fluorescent Yellow and Green, and maybe a little of the Aethermatic Blue. The precise ratio of the mix doesn't really matter, and you may in fact wish to vary the tone across different parts of the figure to create some further interest. We can also mix these colours directly into the white to add some additional highlights if needed. I might also gently glaze some of these more fluorescent tones into the highlights of the robes too. Finally, I might add a touch of weathering by firstly adding some patches of mud spatter or decay with something like Typhus Corrocsion. And I'm now dry brushing some of Vallejo's buff to the lower part of the robes to create some dusty weathering. I'm now adding a few final touches using the various elements already introduced until I'm happy with the overall look. All that remains now is to provide some basing, so as usual, I'm first applying some dark earth basing paste by Vallejo, before adding a few rocks. Once fully dry, I'm providing a dry brush using buff, then ivory to pick out the texture. And for the shadow men, I've also mixed in a little of the fluorescent green. I'm then shading things down with some Agrax Earthshade before gluing down my grass tufts by Gamer's Grass. And this completes the Orc Taskmasters, Pit Goblins and the Shadow Men. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. As always, you can find chapter links and a product list in the video description below, along with all of the places I can be reached on social media and Spotify. My very special thanks go to my kind patrons for supporting this work. If you'd like to become a patron, you can find out more by hitting the Patreon link. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from the Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. Happy painting!